Our second scripture is Romans 12, 1 through 21. I appeal to you, therefore, siblings, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God, which is your spiritual worship. Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your minds, so that you may discern what is the will of God, what is good and acceptable and perfect. For by the grace given to me, I say to everyone among you, not to think of yourself more highly than you ought to think, but to think with sober judgment, each according to the measure of faith that God has assigned. For as in one body we have many members, and not all the members have the same function, so we, who are many, are one body in Christ, and individually we are members one of another. We have gifts that differ according to the grace given to us: prophecy in proportion to faith, ministry in ministering, the teacher in teaching, the exhorter in exhortation, the giver in generosity, the leader in diligence, the compassionate in cheerfulness. Let love be genuine. Hate what is evil, hold fast to what is good. Love one another with mutual affection. Outdo one another in showing honor. Do not lag in zeal. Be ardent in spirit. Serve God. Rejoice in hope. Be patient in suffering. Persevere in prayer. Contribute to the needs of the saints. Extend hospitality to strangers. Bless those who persecute you. Bless and do not curse them. Rejoice with those who rejoice. Weep with those who weep. Live in harmony with one another. Do not be haughty, but associate with the lowly. Do not claim to be wiser than you are. Do not repay anyone evil for evil, but take thought for what is noble in the sight of all. Beloved, never avenge yourselves, but leave room for the wrath of God. For it is written, "Vengeance is mine, I will repay," says God. No, if your enemies are hungry, feed them. If they are thirsty, give them something to drink. For by doing this, you will heap burning coals on their heads. Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. On this day, perhaps even in Veterans Day, if Veterans Day was not on the calendar for tomorrow, it feels very appropriate to honor those who have served. Let me explain. While we, in following Jesus, have been taught to turn the other cheek and to choose peacemaking over violence, peacemaking is also not a passive thing. Jesus himself spoke truth to power and found the empire trying to silence him because his words of love God and love neighbor were so radically countercultural that they threatened the empire. When asked why someone chooses to serve, many will say that they felt called to peacemaking. That is the radical act of speaking and working for truth and justice in the face of an empire that is oppressing its people. Today, we are sharing a few stories of veterans whose stories are not often shared. Women, and in one instance, a person who was assigned female at birth, but lived as a man after serving their country. Hear these stories, and know that as we speak their names, we honor all who served to make the world a little more just.
From the Revolutionary War here in the United States. Deborah Sampson became a hero of the American Revolution when she disguised herself as a man and joined the Patriot Forces. She was the only woman to earn a full military pension for participation in the Revolutionary Army. Born on December 17, 1760, in Plimpton, Massachusetts, near Plymouth, Sampson was one of 7 children to Jonathan Sampson Jr. and Deborah Bradford Sampson. Both were descendants of preeminent pilgrims, Jonathan of Miles Standish and Priscilla Alden, his wife, the great-granddaughter of Massachusetts Governor William Bradford. Still, the Sampsons struggled financially, and after Jonathan failed to return from a sea voyage, his impoverished wife was forced to place her children in different households. 5 years later, at age 10, young Deborah was bound out as an indentured servant to Deacon Benjamin Thomas, a farmer in Middleborough with a large family. At age 18, with her indenture completed, Sampson, who was self-educated, worked as a teacher during summer sessions in 1779 and 1780, and as a weaver in winter. In 1782, the war raged on. At that time, the patriotic Sampson disguised herself as a man named Robert Shirtliff and joined the 4th Massachusetts Regiment. At West Point, New York, she was assigned to Captain George Webb's Company of Light Infantry. She was given the dangerous task of scouting neutral territory to assess British buildup of men and material in Manhattan, which General George Washington contemplated attacking. In June of 1782, Sampson and 2 sergeants led about 30 infantrymen on an expedition that ended with a confrontation, often one-on-one, with Tories. She led a raid on a Tory home that resulted in the capture of 15 men. Sampson, like many veterans of the Revolution, also claimed that she fought during the siege of Yorktown, digging trenches, helping storm a British redo, and enduring cannon fire. However, a neighbor's diary discovered in 2019 cast doubt on Sampson's claim that she fought at Yorktown. For over 2 years, Sampson's true sex had escaped detection despite close calls. When she received a gash in her forehead from a sword and was shot in her left thigh, she extracted the pistol ball herself. She was ultimately discovered a year and a half into her service in Philadelphia when she became ill during an epidemic, was taken to a hospital and lost consciousness. Receiving an honorable discharge on October 23, 1783, Sampson returned to Massachusetts. On April 7, 1785, she married Benjamin Gannett from Sharon, and they had 3 children, Earl, Mary, and Patience. The story of her life was written in 1797 by Herman Mann, entitled The Female Review, or Memoirs of an American Young Lady. She received a military pension from the state of Massachusetts, although Sampson's life after the Army was mostly typical of a farmer's wife. In 1802, she began a year-long lecture tour about her experiences, the first woman in America to do so, sometimes dressing in full military regalia. 4 years after Sampson's death at age 66, her husband petitioned Congress to pay as the spouse of a soldier. Although the couple was not married at the time of her service in 1837, the committee concluded that the history of the Revolution furnished no other similar example of female heroism, fidelity, and courage. He was awarded the money, though he died before receiving it.
The Civil War. Jenny Hodgers was born in County Louth, Ireland in 1843. After immigrating to America and settling in Illinois, Hodgers enlisted in the 95th Illinois Infantry in 1862. At 19 years of age, adopting the alias of Albert Cashier. Jenny, or Albert, kept to himself and was the shortest soldier in the regiment and was considered a good soldier. They served for more than 3 years, fighting in more than 40 battles and traveling almost 10,000 miles. After the war, Cashier continued to live as a man, moved back to Illinois, and worked as a handyman. In 1911, Cashier was in an automobile accident, and while hospitalized and recovering from their injuries, it was discovered for the first time that they were biologically a woman. Cashier passed away in 1915 and was given a funeral with full military honors. The headstone reads, Albert D.J. Cashier, born Jenny Hodgers in Ireland, 1843 to 1915.
World War I. Women were eager to show their patriotic support for the war effort. During the Great War, 21,498 U.S. Army nurses and 1,476 U.S. Navy nurses served in military hospitals in the United States and overseas. It was the first time Army and Navy military nurses performed active duty abroad. In the United States, African Americans lived and worked in a segregated society, and this was reflected in their wartime participation. Founded in 1908, the National Association of Colored Graduate Nurses supported Black nurses in their fight against racial discrimination. As a result of increased pressure to allow African American women to participate in the Red Cross, 18 Black nurses were stationed at Army bases in Illinois and Ohio to care for African American soldiers and German prisoners of war. For the first time, women who were not nurses were allowed to enlist in the armed forces, serving stateside and thereby freeing male soldiers to go overseas. The Navy and the Marines accepted 13,000 women into active duty, and a much smaller number were accepted into the Coast Guard. These women served primarily in clerical positions with the same rank, responsibilities, and benefits as men, including identical pay at $28.75 per month. After the war, they received honorable discharges and were treated as veterans eligible for veterans benefits. The U.S. Army had more difficulty in accepting women for military service. While it allowed nurses to enlist in the Army Nurse Corps, they received unequal pay and were not allowed to have a military rank. Civilian women worked in the Army as contract clerical employees and volunteers. They also participated under military command with the Allied Expeditionary Force in France, but only as civilians without military status. 6,000 women also served as telephone operators, clerks, typists, stenographers, translators, and canteen hostesses.
During World War II, American women took to the skies to serve their country as members of the Women's Air Force Service pilots. After Pearl Harbor, U.S. military leaders recognized that the war effort would need more aviators. Two experienced female pilots, Jacqueline Cochran and Nancy Harkness Love, separately proposed recruiting women to assist the Army Air Forces. They argued that women could take over important jobs on the home front, freeing up men to serve in combat. The AAF first created two organizations, the Women's Auxiliary Ferrying Squadron and the Women's Flying Training Detachment. They merged to form the WASP in 1943. Officially, the WASP was a civilian organization that cooperated with the Army. Its members did not have military status. Between 1942 and 1944, more than 25,000 women applied to join the WASP. Of the small number accepted, about 1,000 completed a rigorous training program under the leadership of Cochran and Love. WASP trainees were already accomplished pilots. After joining, they underwent hundreds of hours of flight drills and ground school at Avenger Field in Sweetwater, Texas. They followed Army discipline, marching from place to place and undergoing infantry drills and regular inspections. They studied navigation, meteorology, Morse code, and airplane mechanics. After graduation, WASP pilots went on to fly essential missions for the AAF. They transported thousands of planes from the factories that built them to the military bases that sent them to the front, a process known as ferrying. They towed canvas banners behind their planes to serve as targets for gunnery practice. They instructed male trainee pilots, and they served as test pilots, volunteering for the dangerous work of trying out aircraft that were new or that had been damaged and repaired. 38 WASP pilots died in the course of their service. Because WASP pilots were not military, the federal government refused to pay for their funeral expenses. The women's colleagues had to pool money to send their bodies home to their families. WASP members faced sexism and hostility from many of the men they worked with. The Army paid them considerably less than their male counterparts for the same work. Male commanding officers questioned their judgment and fitness to fly planes. According to the historian Molly Merriman, WASP pilots faced fiercer backlash than other women in uniform, because many men admired and coveted the high-status position of military pilot or flyboy. They resented women who performed daring and adventurous missions that they believed should be for men only. At Love Field in Dallas, Texas, military authorities investigated and disciplined the male commanding officer for treating WASP pilots unfairly. At Cairn Field in Texas, male aviators refused to fly with female pilots after one of the women died in an accident. And the commanding officer of Camp Davis in North Carolina was openly contemptuous of the WASP pilots assigned there. He banned them from 3 of the airfields, preventing them from getting flight practice time. He also assigned them to planes that had not been properly maintained. 2 women died while on duty at that field. Women of color faced a double burden of racism and sexism in joining the WASP. A few were accepted, but their numbers were small. Pilots Hazel Yingli and Maggie Gee, who were of Chinese descent, Verneda Rodriguez and Frances Diaz, who were Latina, and Ola Mildred Rexroth, who was Oglala Sioux, all joined the WASP. Several qualified Black pilots interviewed to join the WASP, but the program turned all of them down. One of those rejected was Mildred Hemmons Carter. She had trained to fly at the Tuskegee Civilian Pilot Training Program, but the Tuskegee Airfield refused to train her on military aircraft because of her gender. The WASP explicitly rejected her because of her race. Decades later, both the WASP and the Tuskegee Airmen recognized Carter as an official member.
We move now to the Vietnam War. Some of you may remember parts of that war. More than 265,000 women served in the military during Vietnam, and approximately 10,000 military women served in country during the conflict in Vietnam. The 8 military women who died in Vietnam while serving their country are all memorialized on the Vietnam Veterans Memorial Wall in Washington, D.C. In addition to Captain Alexander, there are First Lieutenant Sharon Ann Lane, Second Lieutenant Elizabeth Ann Jones, Second Lieutenant Carol Ann Elizabeth Drasba, Lieutenant Colonel Annie Ruth Graham, First Lieutenant Hedwig Diane Orlowski, Captain Mary Therese Klinker, and Second Lieutenant Pamela Dorothy Donovan. This is the story of Eleanor Grace Alexander, the only woman of the 1,563 New Jerseyans who died while deployed during the Vietnam War. Eleanor was born September 18, 1940, in Queens, New York. Childhood friend Walter Hahn recalled Eleanor as an intelligent and active girl who was moved up a grade in elementary school. Together, they tried to grow apple trees and played in the park. As they grew up, he recalled that Eleanor was an attractive brunette and a lot of fun. Eleanor attended St. Michael's High School in Manhattan, graduating in 1957. She went on to study nursing at DeUville College School of Nursing in Buffalo, graduating in 1961 with her Bachelor of Science. Following graduation, she moved to Rivervale, New Jersey to be closer to family. For the next 6 years, she worked as an operating room nurse at Madison Hospital in upstate New York before joining the Army Nurse Corps in May of 1967. Though she was engaged to be married, she felt this was something she needed to do first. Her friend Han recalled fearing for her safety when she enlisted, urging her to serve her country in the Peace Corps instead. Undeterred, though, Eleanor finished her training at Brooke Army Medical Center in Houston. She was assigned to the 44th Medical Brigade, 85th Evacuation Hospital, 55th Medical Group, and began her tour in Vietnam, June 6, 1967. The 44th Medical Brigade was constituted in the regular Army on December 30th, 1965. The brigade was activated on January 1st, 1966, at Fort Sam Houston, Texas, the home of the Army Medical Department. In April 1966, the brigade moved to Vietnam, where it participated in 12 of the 17 campaigns in which U.S. forces were involved. During this tour, the brigade was awarded 2 Meritorious Unit Commendation Streamers by the government of the Republic of Vietnam. In March of 1970, the personnel at the brigade headquarters were consolidated with those of the U.S. Army Vietnam Surgeon's Office to form the Medical Command Vietnam, and the brigade colors returned to the continental United States in December of 1970. While serving with this impressive unit, Captain Alexander was killed on November 30th, 1967. She was returning from a temporary assignment in Pleiku, treating soldiers wounded in the Battle of Dak To. The plane she was on crashed, killing all 26 aboard. Eleanor was just 27 years old when she died and had been in Vietnam less than a year. She wasn't even supposed to be in Pleiku, but had voluntarily taken the place of another nurse. That woman wrote to Eleanor's family on the anniversary of her death for years. Several days passed before the Department of Defense made the crash public. The New York Times announced on December 4th, a twin-engine United States Air Force transport plane carrying 26 Americans and secret documents crashed Thursday in the coastal lowlands of south of Quang Thanh. There were no survivors, but the documents were recovered intact. The crash site was in an enemy-held area about 275 miles northeast of Saigon. For this reason, the accident was not reported until today. The delay permitted search operations to be concluded without giving the Viet Cong any information on them. End of that quote. Eleanor's loss haunted fellow nurse and friend Rona Prescott, in whose stead Eleanor had gone on that flight. She left nursing after the war and went back to school and trained to be a therapist. She found work counseling veterans suffering from post-traumatic stress syndrome, PTSD or PTSS. Coping with her own memories, she spent years penning a letter to Eleanor, which she finally finished in 1991.
We hear these stories and know that there are so many more stories of people whose service went unnoticed and unrecorded. Of course, the work of naming violence within the empire is not just done by those who serve in a branch of the military or even as a first responder. This work is done by the poets, the dreamers, the artists. It's done by our medical professionals who work tirelessly to heal. It is done by activists, protesters, lawyers, and judges. It is done by teachers, parents, and caregivers who raise children in what feels like impossible times. It is done by all those who have a hope that tomorrow will bring more justice, wholeness, and more peace. It is done by you, by me, and we rely on each one of us to do more work together than we could ever do individually. Thank you, dear ones, for being faithful to the work that God calls us to do.